Good evening, everyone.
Good evening.
Good evening, everyone.
Good evening.
I know y'all had a long day, but we're gonna get through this. So, before we get started, we're gonna do like a little exercise, to kind of like get us back in motion, like we was this morning. So I would like everyone to stand up. If you can't stand up, that's fine. If you don't want to stand up, that's fine. I would like everyone to stretch their hands. As you're stretching your hands, I just want you to move your head and just relax and close your eyes. Now, I would like everyone to just stretch their hands out and just reach to the sky. Yes. Move your body. Good. Let's inhale some breaths. Let's exhale. Now, I want everybody to just scream. Thank you. Yes, that's that NOLA culture, that NOLA. Thank you, you're welcome.
That sets us up perfectly to talk about rage. I was asked to make one announcement, so let me do that real fast. Coming up April 25th to 27th, our annual Ecumenical Advocacy Days, which normally are held in person in DC, but this year they are all virtual. So if you have wanted to participate in the past and could not, because we are always committed to the Alliance gathering, you can go to advocacydays.org and participate virtually with your representatives April 25th to 27th. The emphasis this year is turning swords into plowshares, and the ask is about reducing military spending and instead funding programs and projects that help people thrive. So you may join other Christians of all denominations this week and contact your representatives and senators, they are sometimes sinister, senators, and ask for a reduction in military spending and then redirecting to food and housing and so much more at advocacydays.org.
Before you start, some of us have trouble hearing, but you hold the mic up close.
Okay.
Absolutely.
Look at Andy today, and he said, I hear about 50%.
Okay,
So anybody can hear me from the back?
good.
Okay, thank you. All right.
So in our reimagining retreat, we use a framework of rage and lament, moving toward joy and hope. But we don't want to get to the joy and the hope too fast. We want to hold that space for rage and lament. In Patrice Culler's book, Abolitionist Handbook, step number 6 is about allowing yourself to feel. If you're an Enneagram 4 like me, this is the melancholy, dark, good feeling stuff. Those who seek to work in the world of abolition likely come from a world designed to numb feelings. Audre Lorde wrote, pain is important. How we evade it, how we succumb, how we deal with it, how we transcend it. So we're going to make some space in this second session. Again, we're giving you 2 hours worth of what is really a 2.5-day experience to really hold that rage and hold that lament safely here. We also lean on Valerie Carr, the great Sikh writer, who says divine rage is fierce, disciplined, and visionary. The aim of divine rage is not vengeance, but to reorder the world. It is precise and purposeful, like the focused fury projected into the world from the forehead of the goddess Kali. It points us to the humanity of even those who we are fighting. Perhaps our task as human beings is to find safe containers for our raw reactionary rage, and then choose to harness that energy in a way that creates a new world for all of us. So over the course of our 2.5 days, we make that very intentional space for rage. We move into intentional listening, and then toward reimagining new solutions together. And so we're not going to get to that joy and hope just yet. We're going to hang out still in this rage and listening and reimagining. And we have
In the retreats and in the work, we do spend time marinating so we understand. We've heard a lot about the importance of that. And then we begin to talk about restorative justice. How many of you have heard the phrase before? How many of you feel like it's something you're very familiar with? How many of you think it is restorative circle work? And I ask that in part of what we do is to bring in people who are restorative facilitators. The Center for Restorative Approaches in New Orleans has been around for 20 years, and Troy Bechet comes in and talks about restorative justice. And we're going to talk some about it here today, and I want to frame it, and the reason I ask about the circles, Troy talks about that as the work. And when you look at what restorative justice is, one of the definitions is, restorative justice seeks to examine the harmful impact of a crime and then determines what can be done to repair that harm while holding the person who caused it accountable for his or her or their actions. And so it is about listening. It is about speaking truth. And it has been a really amazing experience for me in the context, because what happens, and the reason in part that we go back to, we need more police, we need more jails, I'm going to cancel all that out, is because it's the only thing we've been fed. And so in these rooms sometimes, for people who are not familiar with the concept of restorative justice, it's like the oxygen has been infused into the room and folks are like, oh, another opportunity. And so what restorative justice in part is about, and I want to posit that it's not simply about the criminal legal system, and if we think about the principles of restorative justice being an everyday practice, that we listen open-hearted to one another, that we speak when we're able to what the harm is for us, that we listen actively to one another. It's a practice I try to do more and more at home because I'm not necessarily a great listener, and that we work together to find solutions. The work of restorative justice falls within the court system, and we're going to talk some about that, and I want to lift up some challenges around that too, because the concept of circles and those sorts of things are important, but there are assumptions in that definition I just gave you. One of the assumptions is the person who is identified as the harmer did in fact harm. New Orleans is the epicenter of mass incarceration. It is the epicenter of exoneration as well. So I simply plant that extra seed to say, I need to own my actions when I have harmed, but are we creating another system that takes things away? It is utilized in schools. Troy does a lot of work in schools. So it's a salve in that place to say, instead of sending children away, we have this circle where community comes together, and there are conversations that are open and honest and facilitated by a trained individual. It's used in pre-charging in some areas. They're working to do this in Orleans Parish. We have a district attorney who used to be a public defender. And so he's a progressive district attorney. Again, important and something I have to ponder, because are we progressive if we have a district attorney that's progressive? We've still got work to do, y'all.
And he was featured in the short film that we watched yesterday.
Yes,
Jason
Jason
Williams.
was in that. the other component is it takes away some rights. The way the system works is that it means that you have to speak to your truth as a person who did a harm, and what we know is you have the right to remain silent because anything you say can and will be used against you. And so as we talk about restorative justice and where it's coming in, how are we ensuring that the protections are there? I will share that I came to this particular work and left my work in the courtroom because one of the things the system does is there's a harm that occurs, and what's natural is if I've harmed you, we have this conversation. And the system says anything I say can be used against me, and my lawyer says don't say a word. And the district attorney says to you, you can't engage with that person who harmed you. And so a year or a year and a half passes, or 3 or 4 years, depending on the city. And whether I've owned up to it or I've been convicted at trial, then I come to say, I apologize for what I've done, and you can't hear it. Because what's natural, we're now ingrained in the hurt. And so there's a way that restorative justice can come in and allow for those conversations so that healing, we talk about generational harm, it carries forward. In parole hearings in Louisiana, families come for people who were survivors. Mama Glow, who served 50+ years in the women's prison in Louisiana, when she got to her final parole hearing, the children and grandchildren of the man that was killed in the robbery that went wrong when she was 16 came in and they were angry. This woman has never spoken to us before in 50 years. And why is that? Because the system didn't allow for it. And when she was freed on that day, the system said, one of the conditions is you may not contact these victims. Their words. And so when we talk about restorative and healing, it's about listening and engaging and coming together in truth. We can do it in school systems. Right here in Atlanta, there are some schools that are doing peer courts. So again, it's not even the adults involved. It's young people who are brought in together to sit in a room when there's something that's happening. And I'll tell you one example, and then we'll go into talking about this more broadly. There was a young man who was getting in trouble for misbehaving in one particular class, and he was going to get written up, and he was potential expulsion. And so he got to go to the peer court, and it was young people that were chosen, and not just, quote, the stars of the school. They picked peer judges to listen and engage as community around this young man, this young boy who's in high school. And he started talking about what was going on and why it wasn't happening. And somebody said, but you never do your homework in math. And I know that because we've got class together and I sit next to you. And so from this restorative process, that young man's grades not only went up because he had peers who said, we see you and we want you to do well. And so we're talking about seeing the individuals on all sides, and that includes the community. And not only did he begin to do better in class, he started showing up to school in a tie. What's that saying? Not only did he get seen by others, it allowed him to see himself and show himself. And so, of course, I'm not talking about all kids suddenly being in ties, but it allowed him to show his power. And that's what it's about, is empowering. And so it is also still and sometimes the way it's presented as a downstream solution. We're going to talk about some of that. I encourage us to think about how it's an upstream solution. If we are listening to the literal cries of communities, that there are not livable wages, that there's not housing that anyone would want to live in, and they're living there, that the mamas and the papas are working 4 jobs, that the kids aren't in school because there's no reason to be. What restorative practices do our communities have, and responsibilities do we as communities have to one another? And so we're going to talk a little bit about what does it mean to integrate restorative practices into community, into the criminal system. We're just going to take out legal too. It's just a criminal system. Like you own me into that.
Well, I thought that it might be helpful. I wonder what my role is in this, because I am very much a student of restorative approaches and still figuring out how this works in a practical sense. So I thought maybe I'll put on a Ron DeSantis hat here and say, well, these are real bad folks who have done bad things, and you can't just sit around and kumbaya your way out of crime. These folks need to be punished. So our system is extremely punitive. That is the only function is that it causes harm, because we think that someone needs to pay. So what is the practical role of restorative justice in this criminal system that just wants punishment?
Good evening, everyone. For me, a person who has been impacted by the criminal legal system, I always put myself in spaces where I try to get people to understand another way, right, why things happen in society, right? One of the things that I've learned is doing this work is that in Louisiana system teaches folks who are operating these legal systems to think in a more antiquated mentality, right? And what that does is that allows the people who are operating these systems to work in one way, right? Their mentality is just not as progressed, like how, Caroline was talking about the district attorney in New Orleans, like how he's very progressive when it comes down to when court cases come into his office and things like that, whether he's going to accept it or not and things like that. And so what I do is that I go into places where people who are operating these systems, like the correction facility, right? I have entered into a lot of correction facilities in the state of Louisiana, and a lot of in these correction facilities, you have a lot of women of my experience, right, who are housed in these facilities, right, and how these women are being treated as they are being treated with abnormal abnormality. I'm sorry. They're treated with an abnormality, right? And so one of the things that what I have done was, having conversations with the warden of this correction facility, right? And explaining to him, like, when you have these programs, you need to start allowing women of my experience to be more inclusive, to be able to, to be able to engage into these programs, because just because we may look different to you doesn't mean that we can't teach the same skill, right, as you. And so what he have done was he began to start putting women of my experience within different programs within the facility, right? Another thing is that, I encourage him to do is to start having sensitivity trainings to get people to have an understanding on when they are dealing with people who are incarcerated. You will be able to approach that person in a way that they would prefer to be approached as. Pronouns is important, right? Calling them by, if you don't feel comfortable with them calling them by their first name, call them by their last name, something that will put that person in a perspective to be very comfortable and be able to be more, feel more inclusive, feel inclusiveness as, other people who are housed in this facility. And so for me, I just feel like it's just important to, give people who are operating these systems to try to give them an understanding in a way that because they're only doing it because of what they have been taught, if that makes sense, and so that's me.
So there are some opportunities for restorative approaches on the inside.
Yeah.
What are some opportunities for restorative approaches? Let's say Caroline, maybe you can speak to this, that someone has been arrested. It's all pre-trial. What is a way that restorative mediation might happen? How is that playing out in real life already?
Orleans Parish, again, because we have a district attorney that used to be a public defender, they're in the process of engaging the Center for Restorative Approaches in particular cases, which is part of the tension, to bring the person harmed and the person, I'm going to say harmer because in order to engage in this particular practice, you have to acknowledge your actions all the way around, is to do it in a pretrial context as a way to potentially do diversion. Now, diversion takes a lot of different modalities and a lot of different courts, but ultimately it would be a situation where they would not be convicted and would not have to go to prison. They would get services. They would not have to go to jail. And so in that particular place, it allows for a diversionary component, and it also allows for the voice of the person who was harmed to come into play early on. Meaning that part of what the restorative practices do in this context is to allow the people that are engaged both as directly harmed and as the community to speak to, this is the circumstance, and these are potential outcomes that we would like to see. And it allows for the getting to the why earlier on in a community context. So everybody's got a story, y'all. Everybody's got a story. And there's always a why, and there's always a why behind the why. And so to give someone the space to say, here's what was going on for me when I stole your car. Was it joyriding? That's what some might call it. And once you get into the conversation about it, it goes back to what somebody else said before. We're bored and we got nothing to do. There are a million different reasons that something like that happens. It allows for a being heard, and I can't tell you how many times when we talk about engaging with individuals and actually listening to them, and there may be people in the room here potentially, where you've never actually been heard. And so on both ends, it allows that to come through. Now, I will tell you from a practical standpoint, the politics have gotten involved. How about that? You've got a DA that wants to do it, you've got a community that's supporting it, and you've got a city council that's getting in the way of it because they have to write a check. And so that there's that piece too in terms of pretrial. There is also what it means though, they're not convicted, but the arrest is still there. And so you need to do it even before there are charges. And there are some places in the country that are doing that where it's pre-arrest diversion, which makes for a big difference. Because if a person's applying for a job or housing and the background check is run and you've been arrested and it's not expunged, sealed from the public, if you don't have a conviction, it doesn't matter because it still impacts you.
In a lot of this work, my role as mom comes out the strongest, I think, because what I keep imagining with restorative approaches is what might happen in our country if we implemented restorative approaches in preschool and kindergarten and throughout elementary school. So rather than schools calling the cops when somebody's disrupting a classroom, that there is this community of loving kindness that has already become the practice. This is what we do when harm is caused. And one of our exercises is to think about early childhood. What's one of your very, very earliest memories of getting in trouble? Don't holler them out loud, but just sit and think about that for a minute and hold it. Since I have the microphone, I'll share that one of my very earliest memories comes from kindergarten when I told Gaines Johnston that he should come into the girls' bathroom. And then I went to the kindergarten teacher and said, Gaines Johnston is in the girls' bathroom. And so when he got in trouble, he said, but Elizabeth Mangum told me to go to the girls' bathroom. And so then there was conversation between the three of us, and Ms. Ponder's response was to take us all on field trips of the girls' bathroom and the boys' bathroom so we could see what went on in each of these spaces, right? When we can think back as far as our imagination goes, most of us have something that's pretty innocent like that, right? And most of us, if we're really lucky, have stories of people who responded lovingly and appropriately. So I wonder if either of you could speak to, I know that neither of you was a juvenile justice expert, but can you speak to some examples of how restorative approaches are more age appropriate too at times, especially when dealing with the juvenile criminal legal system?
I have 3 kids I'm raising. I have a niece who's she's 15. I have a oldest boy that I'm raising who is 12, and I have a youngest boy. The youngest boy who I'm raising, the youngest out of all, is 10. And so the 12-year-old, I'm very hard on him, and the reason why is because I've been having him since birth. Him and his little brother. These are my niece kids, and so and the purpose of me raising them is that because my niece is experiencing substance abuse, and she has been experiencing substance abuse since she was 15 years old. And so, as these young boys grew up, you know, society, right? Society teaches them that, you know, what their mother is doing is wrong and it's bad and things like that. And so one of the things that I kind of like instilled in them is that when it comes down to Black women, you know, I say Black women are so disrespected to the world, right? And so I always instill that in them, but also to talk to them in ways to get them to understand that, you know, what your mother is going through, she's not doing it because that's something that she want to do. She's doing it because she's trying to harbor herself, right, from the different pains that she had to deal with, you know, coming up. And so they kind of got it, you know, but then it was like they didn't. And so what I did was I allowed them to have a conversation with their mother, and then they began to ask questions to her. And one of the things that I told her is that you just be truthful, you know. And so I'm glad I did that, you know, in spite of what their mother is going through. You understand what I'm saying? Every time they see their mother, you know, they're happy, you know, they're excited, you know, even when she is dealing with shame and embarrassment and all these different things, you know, they don't see that, they just see mother, right? And so I try to teach them that, right? And so because the world that we live in, you know, focuses on the negativity, because the negativity could bring so much, you know, to a person who is showing that negativity, right? They can monopolize off it. You know, when you're looking at these reality shows, you know, it's consists of drama and all these different things. And so, you know, when they see their mother, you know, they don't see none of that negativity. They just see their mother. So I try to teach them, right? And I just feel like for me, that is important to teach them, not allow them to treat her as how the world may look at her.
Thank you. I want to touch on this too, in terms of the age appropriateness within schools. So there are 3 carceral states: prisons, courts, and schools. And schools in the same way, only we think of imprisonment, but they use suspension, expulsion, and charging and sending to juvenile court. So they're othering, they're distancing, they're cutting out. I was raised, my parents would say children are meant to be seen and not heard, and sometimes not seen. And so to teach young people as you are, is teach children, imagine a 3 and 4-year-old, a 5-year-old, learning how to express themselves in a way that they can be heard. Imagine if I had known when I was 5 years old how to listen to someone else in a way that lets me understand their truth. And imagine that we are integrating that in a system that doesn't do listening. we could go into the path of what the hearings are like and how quick it is to expel somebody. And again, it's Black and brown children that are being sent out. And we're talking about taking children through this. What impact does it have on the adults in the room that have to learn the process, to get to engage the young people in the process? The healing that occurs for those who are in charge as well. I think it's a beautiful idea. I wish my mama had been like you.
Yeah, and it's important, and just to add this to it, like that 12-year-old, he's doing great in his academics, for to say that he's dealing with so much. You know, since kindergarten, he's always had a high GPA. He's in 6th grade. He looked like he's in the 9th or 10th grade. He's in the city of New Orleans. You know, he's like #1 in regards to like sports and stuff like that. And so people looks at me like, how you're able to do these things, you know. I just try to teach them and expose them to a lot of things so they can have an understanding of, you know, how life is.
I wonder, I always wonder with speakers and audiences what you're feeling on that side. I feel that in some of when we're talking conceptually about everything that is just toxic and destructive about the criminal legal system, I feel it up here. Like I'm angry and it's in my head and I'm raging and my shoulders are getting tight. And as we start to talk about these approaches, I'm softening and my voice is softer and I feel the humanization that restorative approaches calls for. It is a lot more work. What we've been told by the Center for Restorative Approaches is that they prepare hundreds of hours before everyone comes together in a circle, responding to whatever harm has been caused. But it allows everyone in that circle not just to be heard, but to be seen as fully human. And white folks are really allowed so much grace to make all kinds of mistakes, including knocking on the wrong door when you go to pick up your 16-year-old or your younger brothers. And so I just am feeling that in my body right now of what would it feel like to de-escalate this whole system into where we are honoring the full humanity of other people. Patrisse Cullors, again, in her book, Abolitionist Handbook, talks about the difference in passive forgiveness and active forgiveness. Forgiving passively means you accept and forget. I would say in the criminal legal system, you also forget about the person who's been incarcerated, right? You lock them up and throw away the key, people like to say. Forgiving actively means you become part of the process, even if it's uncomfortable. Forgiveness is rooted in the idea that we value each other and we are committed to each other's growth and healing and transformation. It also requires that we be self-reflective. All this sounds like a lot of time and work. We Americans are not good. We don't like these things. We want it fast and we want it to not hurt us. Forgiving actively gives the forgiver an agency that is often unmet when we hold on to what or who has harmed us. And I think about the family of the woman who was involved in the Mama Glow story, 50 years that they have held on to their anger. That's a different kind of rage, right? That's a different kind of container. That is a self-harming container for rage. It's not productive in moving towards growth and wholeness. It is, it devoured them and stole 50 years from their lives. Well, maybe I'm rambling there. So I wonder if either of you might speak to missed opportunities. Can you think of some missed opportunities when a restorative approach would have been transformational and instead either the system didn't allow for it or both parties wouldn't participate in it?
Can you elaborate more on that question?
I mean, Caroline, maybe in your experience as a defense attorney, there are times that maybe that you wanted to advocate for a different way forward, but if you don't have everyone agreeing to that.
And that's a piece of it is there has to be an agreement for this particular work to happen. It has to be on both sides. I would say every time that there was a case that came to court, every time, frankly, every time the police were called is a missed opportunity. Every time, because of everything we know. Because the crunching of the system began, because of the opportunity. I mean, with the woman that I think it was Derica talked about this morning, who said, I called the police simply because I needed to stop the argument because I didn't have any other tool. Again, we've been bamboozled and trained into thinking that's the only option we have. And frankly, I mean, that's what it is. So every opportunity is there. There was when you asked the question, there was one case that came to mind, and I'll do the synopsis very quickly. There was a young woman who had been a prison guard that got involved with an inmate. She lost her job and he was soon released. In a matter of circumstances, she ended up being a part of a murder that was really horrific, and the person, it was bad. And there was this separation component. And the verdict came in about 8 o'clock at night. Now, this was in Minnesota, so there was actually a full trial, and there was actually patience in allowing the juries to be selected and that sort of thing. In New Orleans, the trial would have taken a day. The verdict came in, and the young woman was convicted. We can talk about all that another time. The courthouse is dark. It's 8 o'clock at night. Nobody's there but us in the courtroom. And the families on both sides, and they've been together and been together and been together and not talked. They've glared, it's tense. We have to wait until the dead man's family is taken out all the time. And we get down to the main level on this last night, and the mother of Tina goes over to the mother of the young man that was murdered, away from everybody in the dark of this room, and they embrace and they cry together. What if 2 years before, those mothers could have sat together?
I'm just sitting with that. I'm thinking about another client you had who, I feel like it was also maybe a murder case, and you said at some point you were looking through her history and determined that in school-age years, she had missed over 100 days at the classroom in one academic year.
Yeah, it was a sex trafficking case, actually.
Okay.
And sadly, a 19-year-old who was being federally prosecuted because she took a 14-year-old across state lines at the direction of her aunt, and she was fourth generation. Her mother's pimp had been her pimp when she was a child. And I got her school records, and that was fifth grade. She was not in school and nobody did anything. Nobody showed up at the mother's house. In sixth grade and seventh grade, and she had about a ninth grade education, and the complexities of it. And I will say the complexities for that young woman, I'm gonna tell y'all the complexities for her mother, because I got to engage with her and the trauma she had been through and continues to deal with. And so when we talk about paying attention and showing up fully, when we talk about that carceral state, the lead investigator for the feds, federal prosecutors, had been the local investigator, the cop. This same young woman had gotten arrested when she was 16 because she and somebody else had robbed the client. I'm sorry, I'm okay with that. Because we don't ever go after the Johns. We don't ever go after the purchasers. 16 years old. and she gets prosecuted now as a juvenile. And so when the feds come in 3 years later and they've got that same person who could have intervened, and so I will say, where's the restorative justice?
Yeah.
That the system owes that young woman, owes her family, and she is thriving, y'all. She is thriving. She graduated from high school. She's got poetry that's published. She's got a job that she loves, and she's got 2 beautiful children that she's bringing up. So I'm gonna say hallelujah, because God does work, but not through that system.
Yeah, I'm really thinking and processing in real time here in a way that I haven't in the 3 or 4 reimagining retreats we've led so far. That restorative approaches, we can talk about this very technical thing itself that happens, that you're trained for, and you go and you facilitate, but also it's a way of approaching life. I mean, I'm really hearing in this a way of approaching all interactions that we have with the other human beings in order to fully understand the story. I shared with you that Mary Lou Kanaki quote yesterday. There isn't anyone you couldn't love once you've heard their story. And in this work, I think the 3 of us could sit here and just tell other people's stories for the next couple of hours, right? Person after person, who may well have caused harm and then was so harmed by the system and the lack of opportunities for healing and forgiveness and restoration to take place. I'm also thinking for congregations who are discerning, hopefully you are listening to Spirit and asking, how am I being called into this work? How might my congregation be called into this work? I think that there are some opportunities, especially, again, my heart really being for elementary school and preschool and Head Start kind of programs, that for advocating for these approaches at early ages, not just waiting for a progressive DA to get voted in, so that maybe the DA slightly softens the system, right? I mean, if we're talking about abolishing, then it needs to be a lifelong project. What other questions or thoughts?
Yeah, I mean,
Yeah, you're good.
yeah, so, we're gonna always hear dramatic stories. But one of the things that I always tell people is that we need to start holding people accountable, right? And I feel like the people who are running this state and this country are the cause of causing and creating all these problems, right? And so, and what that does is that gives people who are operating these systems, or people who are not operating these systems, to be able to cause harm, right, to individuals, right, because of the things that they are creating, right, within our state, within our country. Let's talk about Memphis, Tennessee, like how, they was upset about drag performers performing, I believe, outside. Like, what does that have to do with, how is that an injustice, right? And so, it's just the fact that, and what that does is that creates police brutality. If a police was to see a person who was dressing in drag, or even myself, thinking that I'm a drag queen, right? And I can be harmed, right? And so I just think that when it comes down to the stories that we hear, you understand what I'm saying, that is so dramatic and so traumatic, I mean to say, and we have to hold them accountable, meaning that we need not to vote for them, calling them out, having town hall meetings, encouraging constituents to send emails to them, right? Doing things to like call them out, and that's the problem. We don't do it. It's like we hear what they do, we see what they do, and it's like we're upset for the moment, and then it's like it's back to reality. But when a person who are forced to operate in them systems, then we want to, be very hard. But when they're the ones are being forced to do these things, right? That makes sense. And so we have to start holding them accountable, right? And so and that's what needs to be done.
Before we move into talking about next steps for congregations, I'm just going to take a few minutes to do something that we had not talked about sharing, but is part of the Reimagining Retreat, and that is placing ourselves within sacred story. And since everyone in this gathering, I can assume, is coming from a Christian tradition of some sort, one of the things we would invite you to do in small groups around tables is to share with each other stories that you can think of from your own sacred texts that might model restorative approaches, that might model a different way of repairing harm. In our tradition, we might think about the messaging that if you have a problem with your sister or brother, that you go and speak directly with them, and if they won't listen to you, then you take someone else to go and help mediate and be part of that conversation. And then if that still doesn't progress you towards some kind of resolution, then you get a larger group to go and sit down. Maybe that's an approach. I also think that there is a lot in our in the Gospels that's really helpful for us, because I'm sensitive to, like, we're getting on airplanes and getting in cars and going back, and you want to take this message back. Going back and saying, I'm an abolitionist now, might not land with everybody in your church. But maybe going back and saying, Jesus tells that story about the man who has all these demons and he's been living in the cemetery for years and nobody will talk to him because he makes all these crazy noises, and he's been totally shunned and sent to the edge of town until Jesus gets to him and heals him. Oh, and he's naked. And Jesus gives him clothes to wear. And so then when people from town come by, there's this guy who used to be naked and screaming out in the cemetery, and now he's clothed and in his right mind. And he loves Jesus for it, and he wants to go with Jesus. Oh my goodness, this is the guy who saved me from this schizophrenia or severe mental illness or demons, whatever it was that's going on. He is now clothed in his right mind. And what does Jesus say to him? He doesn't say, come on, let's go. He says, no, you need to get back to your community. Because part of the harm that is caused is because when he got cast out, the community was no longer whole. And so by him being clothed and in his right mind and restored to them, the community is being healed. And then the last one that I'll share, stop me if you've heard me, if you've heard this before. I get this through Barbara Brown Taylor. She drives me nuts, right? Like, why is she so good? And she tells this story that I had never heard before, and now I can't unhear it, about the son that goes away in riotous living. What is the kid? The prodigal son. Goodness gracious. 45 years old. I can't think of the prodigal son. Okay, so so the man has two sons, and one of them says, I want my inheritance, and he goes away and he spends it all in riotous living, says the King James Version. And once the money's gone, the party's over, the friends are all gone, now he's in the pig pen, and he's saying, I've got to go home and talk to my father and get forgiveness, and I'll come home and be a servant. We know this story, right? And while he is still far off, the father sees him and says, kill the fatted calf, runs to him, puts the robe on, and puts the ring on his finger. So Barbara Brown Taylor says, in the first century, in communal tribal living, what that son did was not just an offense to the father, it was an offense to the community. And so the neighborhood, the community had the right to expel this kid forever. And the father wouldn't have had the option of bringing the kid home. And there would have been a ritual called a ketsatsa, that the neighborhood, the community, could have enacted this ketsatsa if they ever laid eyes on this kid, that would have permanently banished him, and nothing the father did could bring him back home. But before the neighbors can enact this ketsatsa, the father is still watching for his son while he's still far off, and he enacts this other ritual of slaughtering the calf and throwing the robe on the kid and putting the ring on his finger and inviting all of the neighbors into his home. So before the son can be cast off forever, instead the community is brought together in celebration and wholeness. So I know that's not technical, that's not like go to your state legislature with this, but I feel like maybe for us to think about our own stories in that way, the scripture that we share on Sunday mornings might be helpful as we're moving into that space of imagining. When you find that there's some pushback of what are you talking about? If we can soften and drop into that heart space of, well, it's like that time Jesus told this story, right? That feels like a helpful transition and framing for me as we move toward talking about next steps for congregations.
I'm not sharing the screen anymore. Yes, that's what I was about to do. Thank you. Where it went away. That's what we talked about. So we're going to talk about joy first.
Do we have the video? If not, I pulled up the transcript.
It's going to be what it was before.
Okay.
Is it okay with y'all if Elizabeth simply reads the text from the?
Yeah, we use this Valerie Carr framing, and there is also an essay which we did not include for y'all by, my brain is so done. Emily Towns from Vanderbilt Divinity School about lament and hope, and it's fantastic as well. So if we were sharing this Valerie Carr video, here's what she would say to you. I've discovered about joy that we cannot force it, but when we create moments to be present to our surroundings, to take breath into our bodies, to sense this present moment, the color and light and feeling of being here alive together, then joy comes more easily. It is a felt sense in our bodies. In the face of horrors visited upon the world daily and the struggle to protect our loved ones, I believe that choosing to let in joy is a revolutionary act. It is the 10th practice of revolutionary love. Joy is the gift of love, for we will be someone else's ancestor one day. And if we get this right, they will inherit not our trauma, but our bravery, born of joy.
Thank you. And so, what next? Take a moment and put your hand on your heart. And put your hand on your other heart. And feel the fullness of what you've been through. It's been not even 48 hours, beautiful ones. And so one of the what next is to take the time to let the ahas solidify. And I don't mean a lot of time, and I don't mean stay in that. I mean, take about 15 minutes in this transition, because transitions matter. How we come home and show up matters. How we use this not as a moment to say, whoa, that was really intense, and get back in the to-dos. And so write them down, pen to paper. What is your takeaway? It can be overwhelming. And Sister Chen Kong talks about the fact that if 10,000 people all take one step, that's 10,000 steps and change comes about. Look around again at who's in this room. Know your community. There are ideas that have popped in your head and your heart in the last 48 hours. Those are messages from God. Hear me again. They're messages from God. And will you act on them, or will you allow them to become dry bones? So go into prayer and say, God, what am I to do with this? And listen. And ask again, God, what am I to do with this? Where am I to step? Because remember, faith without action is dead. And prayer isn't Sunday mornings on a pew, and I know y'all know that. Prayer is everywhere. I can pray in my car. I can pray in the line at Target. It's going to come up, and the question is, what am I to do, and do it? What are you imagining? We've spent time not just talking about the harms, but the vision for the new. The joy of everyone getting to live and thrive in their divine purpose. And to my white comrades, lean into the discomfort. I have to do it all the time. I get to do it all the time. Lean into the fear. Lean into the unknowing. And step forward. Because the path, the net, the wings you have are there for everybody. We've got to do the interpersonal work always. And so what does that look like? There are amazing books. Cherish Books has, we've talked about them. Ms. Davis's book on race and restorative justice, her sister's book on our prisons obsolete, rhetorical question if you're wondering. The center has begun to provide this to the Reimagine Retreat participants in Abolitionist Handbook. I will get one for you if you don't have it, Cindy. And it's been a progress because the church was looking at Paulo Freire's The Oppressor's something or other. Pedagogy. And it was like, I was like, that's old, and the language doesn't fit. And so as I began to dive into Ms. Collier's work, it's that work. Fighting time. Understand the power of reconciliation. I talked about Amy and Isaac. Amy's father was murdered when she was 17. Isaac was pulled out of his bed at the age of 17 from his home where he was resting with his brothers, wrongfully convicted, sentenced to life in prison. This is their story because they got together, and they are now a family unit. So the power of reconciliation is huge. Act and act now. So what I hear a lot of times in this work is our whole congregation's not there, Caroline. What do we do? Our liturgical staff isn't on board. What do we do? 12 men followed another man. I'm gonna say 12 people because we don't know how they identified y'all. Took on the world and walked and took the message. Ernest Johnson is a dear friend and a mentor, although I don't know that he knows he's a mentor. He's my John the Baptist, and I'm Simon Peter, just so y'all know, if I'm one of those. And he says, we don't need a lot of people. In fact, a lot of people get in the way. So take your power team, and that power team may be 1 or 5, and you're gonna bring along the hundreds. Keep your faith strong. God is undergirding this work. Every word that was spoken in these 48 hours, the planning team that came together and the work that they did and the idea that this came for this to be a fruition, that we can take our vision of a world without prisons for good into reality in my lifetime. I understand we're looking at 10,000 years. I'm not willing to be patient. In my lifetime, in your lifetime, a world without prisons for good. So I thank you, I thank you, I thank you. You are not alone. I think I'm supposed to say something about if you want to come to a Reimagine retreat. I have a hard time talking about that. But come on. Or we can come to you. 3 days. Teams from different congregations learning together and figuring out what's their next action step. Dive deep into the knowing, but don't wait, because it is about the lives and the living of our Black and brown brothers and sisters. Let's live, y'all. Let's stand up in our strength and our divine being. And know that every person you encounter is good. and divine. And I encourage you that as you pass every person, say, I love you. Because I love you.
I think that's a good word. We have about 10 minutes if people want to ask us any questions. And I'm glad to take the microphone around, or if you would like to. Our website is a resource. We are a resource. We're at stcharlesave.center. Glad for you to connect with us. If there's one group that has not been named in these past 2 days, I want to name the Innocence Project.
Yes.
And if you do not know about the Innocence Project, look them up. We know a lot of wonderful, wonderful friends who have come home because the Innocence Project did the work to exonerate them and prove that they had been held, a lot of them at Angola, for crimes they did not commit, a lot of them taken in as teenagers, a lot of them forced to pick cotton in our lifetime, picking cotton at Angola. The Innocence Project. So that's gonna be my last pitch. And if you have any questions for us, we're glad to answer. And if you need to, or respond, if you need to go, we're glad to say blessings on your journey.
As people are heading out, if you're not gonna keep could you please leave your name tag? There's a box in the back, so please leave those. We're gonna be taking them to Cuba, because folks in Cuba asked for them. So that's, okay. But anyway, please ask.
Tap it. Just, is it not? Tap it, maybe. Is that the one you were just, oh, there we go.
This question is for Caroline. I'm intrigued with the fact that the DA is a former defense attorney. When police arrest someone and bring them in, they expect that their charge will be charged. How does the police, how is it working for the police who find their DA, I would assume, not to be necessarily on their side? See what I mean?
I hear you. That's a great question, and I will lift up that there are also other DAs in different places, Durham, North Carolina, Minneapolis, Minnesota, Hennepin County, and other places. I think it's a push-pull relationship. There are cops who do the arrest and they're like, it's out of my hands whether you get charged or not. And so they don't care. They just doing the first step. Jason's had a very rough ride from all angles with individuals coming at him, including the voters that supported him because he hasn't held to his truth. That is, I won't try any juveniles as adults, because he was getting political pushback. So it's not fully clear. They're still arresting people, and they're still saying we need more money, which is not true. So thank you.
So that sounds like a diversion experience. I mean, basically somebody has entered the criminal system, but hasn't, they get diverted out of it. And it sounds like what Elizabeth was describing with the schools is an opportunity to not even experience that whole system in the first place. So how can, I mean, I don't, what's my question here? How can we keep people out of the system in the first place while the system still exists? I mean, it's kind of the.
It's great. It's a both and. So what are the resources as people come home so that they can be decarcerated? Sister Hart in New Orleans talks about that, decarcerating. So what are the jobs and housing components? What are our schools doing in the midst of it so that we're not feeding the school to prison pipeline? And then in the middle, what you're talking about is to say, what are we doing differently? I would encourage you to take a look at the roadmap, which we haven't talked about, which is a resource that was created in tandem, the center and others, to talk about from a public health standpoint, what are the sources and resources that need to be there so that when somebody comes in, and Atlanta's actually doing this really well, their pretrial diversion program, which is fed in part by and created by Women on the Rise. Robin wasn't able to join us today, lift her up and her family. Her grandfather transitioned last night. And what it's done is when somebody gets arrested, there's an assessment by an independent, non-law enforcement group that says, you need a job? Is that what's going on? Are you unhoused? Is there a medical issue that might be mental health related or something else? Substance concerns, and services are provided. And that is one of the reasons that the Atlanta City Jail doesn't have 1,300 beds filled, it has 40. And remember what Robin said, $14 million a year because they won't let it go. So it's both and. And so what I always visualize is this is the mouth of the carceral system. It closes as we're taking care of the youngsters and giving them what they need. And as folks come home, and we do systematic work as well in those communities that don't have access to groceries for real food, that don't have school numbers that ought to be, and suddenly it is gone, y'all. So when I say a world without prisons for good, it's possible. We simply have to imagine it, because all of the answers are there. All of the funding is there. I was thinking about this the other day, and I'm going on a little riff. The New Orleans Police Department is complaining because they can't hire folks, because people are leaving the police department in droves because they don't feel like they're respected. Well, all right. Yeah, thank you. And I had this aha. Angola has fewer beds filled. They're sending kids there now. They're sending detainees for ICE to fill beds. And I'm like, where's the money that's not being spent going? Because all of those police jobs that are empty, how about if we send that to the schools in New Orleans East that don't have computers or books? Fill in the blank. And so it's looking at it from a different standpoint. They want us to say this is the only answer. It is right here in this room with us. If we went through the professions of the people in the room here, your professions are the answer. So, our lifetime.
Any other questions?
Anything else? Thank you. That's it. We're going to bring Australia in the room. Mumfa. Mum, Father. Mum for God. You have wrapped this world in the light of divineness. We thank you for living within each of our hearts. We thank you for allowing us to live from that place of love. We know that you have spoken. We go forth seeing the world healed and knowing that we're going to do the work to get there. God has spoken. Let the church say amen.